I'd gotten used to it, honestly. For the past 15 years, my birthday had become just another day, a square on the calendar that no one seemed to notice but me. It wasn't always like this. Back in the beginning, Clara used to care. She'd plan small surprises, bake cakes that were slightly burned around the edges, and laugh at my jokes while insisting the frosting made up for it. But somewhere along the line, the magic faded. My birthday just stopped being important. This year was no different. I woke up early to the smell of coffee brewing and Clara humming in the kitchen. For a moment, I thought, maybe she remembered this time. I walked into the kitchen, ready for a smile, a kiss, maybe even a cheerful, happy birthday, Ethan. Instead, she turned around and said, "We're out of almond milk. Can you grab some on your way home from work?" That was it. No glance at the calendar. No hesitation. Just a reminder to pick up almond milk. I stood there, looking at her, and decided not to say anything. What was the point? After so many years, the expectation had faded. It hurt less if I didn't hope for anything. Work was the usual grind. Emails, meetings, and an awkward lunch break where my coworkers joked about the midlife birthday blues, while I chuckled along, pretending I didn't care. My phone buzzed a few times during the day, but it was just spam or notifications from apps I hadn't used in months. Not a single text from Clara. Not a single call. When I got home, the house was quiet. Clara wasn't there, probably out running errands or meeting a friend. Our daughter, Lily, was staying at her friend's place for a sleepover. The silence wasn't unusual, but it felt heavier today. I sat on the couch with my cat, Luna, purring softly beside me. For a brief second, I thought about calling Clara, but I stopped myself. Why should I remind her? Later that evening, she walked in, juggling grocery bags and chatting on her phone. She barely glanced at me as she passed by, placing a kiss on my cheek that felt like a reflex rather than a gesture of love. I didn't mention my birthday. I didn't ask if she'd forgotten. Instead, I helped her unpack the groceries, nodding along as she told me about her plans for the weekend. It was almost midnight when I got a text. My heart skipped, thinking maybe it was Clara realizing her mistake. But no, it was just another email notification. I laughed bitterly, wondering why I'd even allowed myself to hope. I stayed up late that night, sitting in my office with a glass of whiskey, flipping through an old photo album. There was a picture of us from my 30th birthday, Clara's arms wrapped around me as we blew out candles on a lopsided cake. I could still hear her laugh in my head, see the sparkle in her eyes. What happened to that woman? What happened to us? The next morning, Clara finally realized. She stood in the kitchen, pouring her coffee, when she saw the date on the calendar. Her face paled, and she gasped, "Ethan, yesterday was your birthday." I looked up from my newspaper and raised an eyebrow. Was it? She rushed to my side, guilt painted all over her face. "I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. I've just been so busy with work and the anniversary plans and Lily's activities." I held up my hand, cutting her off. "It's fine, Clara." "No, it's not fine," she said, her voice cracking. I should have remembered. I feel terrible. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this time, the apology would mean something. But deep down, I knew the cycle would repeat. She'd feel guilty for a day or two, make some kind of effort, and then by next year, it would all be forgotten again. So I smiled and said, "Don't worry about it." And I meant it, because this time, I had a plan. This wasn't just about a forgotten birthday. It wasn't about the gifts, or the cake, or the attention. It was about respect, about feeling seen. And if Clara couldn't see me, maybe it was time for her to feel what it was like to be invisible. Our anniversary was coming up in a few weeks, and for once, I decided it wasn't going to be about her. If she could forget my birthday every year, then I could forget her anniversary surprise. Only, it wouldn't be forgetfulness. It would be intentional, deliberate. I wanted her to know exactly how it felt, but I wasn't going to yell or sulk or throw accusations. No, that wasn't my style. Instead, I'd let her own expectations do the work. I'd let her build up the excitement, the anticipation, only to feel the sting of being let down. Some might call it petty. Some might call it revenge. I called it balance. I didn't need to mark the date on the calendar. Clara made sure the entire house knew our anniversary was coming up. By the first week of the month, there were already subtle hints everywhere. Emails open on her laptop with anniversary gift ideas, magazine pages torn out and left on the kitchen counter featuring fancy restaurants and vacation spots, and of course, Clara's not-so-subtle comments during dinner. "I was thinking we could do something big this year," she said one evening, twirling her spaghetti with unnecessary flair. 15 years is a milestone. Maybe a trip or a party, something memorable. Memorable, I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "Sounds nice." She smiled, clearly expecting more enthusiasm. I gave her nothing. Not yet. The days ticked by, and her excitement grew. Every time we passed a jewelry store at the mall, she'd slow down, glancing at the display cases with just enough exaggeration to make her intentions clear. When we watched TV, she'd sigh dramatically during every commercial featuring couples holding hands on a beach or clinking glasses at a candlelit table. "Doesn't that look amazing?" she asked during one particularly cheesy ad. I shrugged. "Sure." She narrowed her eyes at me but said nothing. I could feel her analyzing me, trying to figure out if I was planning something, or if I'd genuinely forgotten. I didn't give her anything to work with. By the second week, she started dropping direct hints. "Ethan, our anniversary is coming up soon. Have you thought about what we should do?" "Not really," I said casually, flipping through the newspaper. She tilted her head. "What do you mean, not really?" "It's 15 years. I shrugged. "We've celebrated anniversaries before. Do we have to make a big deal out of every single one?" Her jaw dropped, and for a second, I thought I'd gone too far. But then she recovered, laughing nervously. "You're joking, right? You're planning something, aren't you? You always do." I smiled faintly. "You'll see." The truth was, I wasn't planning anything. Not the romantic getaway she was hoping for, not the surprise dinner, not the carefully curated gift that would take her breath away. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't going to be the one carrying the emotional weight of our anniversary. Instead, I spent my time preparing something else. A way to show her how it felt to be overlooked, forgotten, and taken for granted. At work, I started piecing it together. Photos from past birthdays where I'd celebrated alone, receipts from dinners I'd eaten by myself while Clara was too busy, and even a few cards she'd hastily scribbled on after realizing she'd forgotten my birthday. It wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding. If Clara could see the years of effort I'd poured into making her feel special on our anniversaries while my own birthdays were barely acknowledged, maybe she'd finally get it. As the anniversary drew closer, her energy shifted. She became more nervous, almost desperate. One evening, she sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "I was thinking," she began, her tone careful, "maybe we could renew our vows. Something intimate with just the two of us." I turned to her, genuinely surprised. "Renew our vows? Why?" She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her phone case. "It's just, I don't know. It feels like we should do something meaningful. Don't you think?" I studied her for a moment. Clara wasn't usually one for deep emotional gestures. She liked surface-level celebrations, the dinners, the gifts, the Instagram-worthy moments. But this felt different. "Maybe," I said, non-committal. Her face fell slightly, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Well, just think about it. No pressure." As the night wore on, I started to notice little cracks in her usual confidence. She'd glance at me more often, almost like she was searching for something in my expression. Validation? Reassurance? I wasn't sure, and I wasn't about to give it to her. The night before the anniversary, she stayed up late, moving around the house with an air of restless excitement. She disappeared into her closet for an hour, then came out with a garment bag, hanging it carefully on the back of the bedroom door. "What's that?" I asked, gesturing toward the bag. "You'll see," she said with a sly smile. I nodded, saying nothing more. She climbed into bed beside me, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I thought about all the times I'd felt this same anticipation on my own birthday, only for it to fizzle out when Clara inevitably forgot. For once, the roles were reversed. She was the one hoping, waiting, wondering if I'd come through. I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about balance. About making her understand. When she drifted off to sleep, I quietly got up, walked to my office, and opened the folder I'd been compiling for weeks. Inside were the memories she'd forgotten. The moments that had meant the world to me but barely registered for her. I wasn't going to ruin our anniversary. I was going to make it unforgettable, for both of us. The alarm buzzed at 6 a.m., but I was already awake. I'd been up for hours, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing how today would go. Clara stirred beside me, her hand instinctively reaching for the alarm clock to silence it. "Morning," she murmured, her voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I could see the excitement brewing in her eyes as she stretched and sat up. This wasn't just any morning to her. This was our anniversary, and by the look on her face, she fully expected something big to happen. I didn't give her much to work with, just a quick kiss on her forehead before heading to the shower. By the time I came out, she was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she brewed coffee and made toast. There was an extra bounce in her step, the kind that came when Clara felt she was the center of attention. She'd even set the table, something she rarely did on a weekday. "Happy anniversary," she said brightly as I walked in, her face glowing with anticipation. I paused, pretending to look confused. "Anniversary? Is that today?" Her smile faltered for a split second before she laughed nervously. "Very funny, Ethan. You almost had me." I just smiled and poured myself a cup of coffee. She waited, watching me closely, expecting me to pull out a card or mention some grand plan. I took a sip of coffee and reached for the newspaper instead. "So," she began, leaning against the counter, "what's the plan for today?" "Plan?" I asked, looking up innocently. Her brow furrowed. "Yes, the plan. For our anniversary." I pretended to think for a moment, tapping my chin. "Well, I've got a busy day at work. Meetings, emails, the usual. Maybe we can grab dinner later?" Her jaw dropped. "Dinner later? Ethan, it's our 15th anniversary. You can't just squeeze it in like it's an afterthought." I shrugged. "What did you have in mind?" She blinked, taken aback by the question. Clearly, she hadn't considered the possibility that I might not have something planned. "I don't know. I thought you'd surprise me. You always do." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence hang between us for a moment. "Always?" "Yes, always," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. "What's going on with you? You've been acting weird all week." I set down my coffee cup and looked at her. "What's going on with me?" "Clara, do you remember what we did for my birthday last month?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Your birthday?" "Yeah, my birthday. Do you remember what we did?" Her eyes darted to the side as she searched her memory. I think wait, I had that work deadline. But we celebrated, didn't we? I mean, I meant to plan something." I nodded slowly, letting her stumble over her words. "Exactly. You meant to, but you didn't." She crossed her arms, defensive now. "What does that have to do with today? This is our anniversary. It's not the same." "It's not?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because to me, it feels exactly the same. The only difference is, today it's your expectations that aren't being met." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me like she didn't recognize the man sitting at the kitchen table. "You're trying to make a point," she said finally, her voice low. "You're punishing me." "I'm not punishing you, Clara," I said calmly. "I'm showing you what it feels like. Because for 15 years, I've gone out of my way to make our anniversary special. And for 15 years, you've barely remembered my birthdays." "That's not fair," she snapped. "Isn't it?" I asked. "Because it seems pretty fair to me." She didn't say anything for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in her head, the realization dawning on her. But Clara was stubborn. She wouldn't admit I had a point. Not yet. "Fine," she said eventually, her voice clipped. "If you want to ruin our anniversary to prove a point, go ahead. But don't expect me to just sit here and take it." I smiled faintly. "I don't expect anything, Clara. That's kind of the whole point." She stormed out of the kitchen, muttering something under her breath. I didn't follow her. Instead, I finished my coffee and left for work, letting her stew in her frustration. I knew I was playing a dangerous game. Clara wasn't the type to let things go easily. But this wasn't about starting a fight. It was about balance, about making her understand what it felt like to be overlooked. As I drove to work, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one scrambling to meet someone else's expectations. I wasn't the one bending over backward to make a day special for someone who barely noticed mine. This time, I was in control. And tonight, Clara would finally see things from my perspective. I didn't get home until late that evening. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp. Clara was sitting on the couch, arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're late," she said, her tone sharp. "Busy day," I replied nonchalantly, setting my keys on the counter. "Lots of meetings." She didn't respond right away, just stared at me like she was daring me to say something, anything, that might redeem the day. When I didn't, she stood up and walked over, her arms still crossed. "Ethan, I need to know. Did you really forget our anniversary?" I sighed, leaning against the counter. "Why does it matter, Clara?" Her eyes widened, and she threw her hands up in exasperation. "Why does it matter? Are you serious? It's our 15th anniversary. You can't just treat it like it's nothing." I stayed quiet for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then, I asked calmly, "Clara, do you know how many of my birthdays you've forgotten?" Her face froze, her mouth slightly open as if she didn't know how to respond. What does that have to do with this?" "Everything," I said, pushing off the counter and standing straight. "For 15 years, I've planned surprises for our anniversaries. Dinners, trips, gifts, you name it. I've put in the effort because it mattered to you. And for 15 years, you've barely noticed my birthday." "That's not true," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Isn't it?" I asked. "Do you even remember what we did for my birthday last year? Or the year before that?" Her lips pressed together tightly, her silence louder than any words she could have said. I crossed my arms and took a step closer. "Clara, I'm not bringing this up to hurt you. I'm bringing it up because today, this anniversary, you're finally feeling what I've felt every single year. Forgotten. Invisible." She flinched at the word. "I never meant to make you feel that way." "But you did," I said, "over and over again. And you know what's worse? I let it slide every time. I never brought it up, never made a big deal about it, because I didn't want to ruin your day. I just swallowed it and moved on." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. But then I remembered the countless nights I'd sat alone on my birthday, pretending it didn't matter. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "I just want you to understand." She turned away, wiping her eyes. "I didn't realize it meant that much to you." "It's not about the birthday itself," I said, my voice softening. "It's about the effort, the acknowledgement, knowing that I matter enough for you to remember something as simple as a date. That's all I've ever wanted." She was quiet for a long time, her back still turned to me. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "You're right. I've taken you for granted." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked over to the coffee table, where I'd left a folder earlier that morning. I picked it up and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, hesitating. "Open it," I said. She sat down on the couch and opened the folder. Inside were photos, receipts, and old birthday cards, evidence of every forgotten celebration. There was a photo of me at a restaurant, sitting alone with a cupcake and a single candle, a receipt from a movie I'd gone to see by myself, a card she'd scribbled on in a rush, with a half-hearted message inside. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "You kept all of this?" "Every year," I said, "not because I wanted to hold it against you, but because I needed to remind myself that my feelings mattered, even if you didn't see them." Tears streamed down her face now, dripping onto the photos. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. I didn't think." "That's the problem, Clara," I said gently. "You didn't think. But now you know." She closed the folder and looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt. "How do I fix this?" I took a deep breath and reached into my pocket. You can start by opening this. I handed her a small envelope, and she stared at it, confused. What is this? Your anniversary surprise, I said. She hesitated, then tore open the envelope. Inside was a printed reservation for a weekend getaway at a luxurious resort. She looked up at me, stunned. You still plan something? Of course I did, I said. Because I love you, Clara. But this trip comes with one condition. Anything, she said quickly, nodding. From now on, my birthday matters just as much as our anniversary, I said firmly. No more excuses. No more forgetting. If I can go out of my way to celebrate you, then I think I deserve the same. She nodded, tears still falling. You do. You absolutely do. And I promise, Ethan, I'll do better. I'll make it up to you. I sat down beside her and took her hand. I don't want you to make it up to me. I just want you to care. That's all. She leaned into me, her head on my shoulder. I do care. I swear I do. I need to show it more. Exactly, I said. For the first time that day, I felt a weight lift off my chest. She finally understood. And while I knew things wouldn't change overnight, this moment felt like the start of something better. You're really something, you know that, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I smiled faintly. I try. That night, we didn't have a grand celebration. Instead, we sat together on the couch, flipping through the folder of memories. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. The morning after our conversation felt lighter, quieter. Clara had spent most of the previous night flipping through that folder of forgotten birthdays. I didn't say much. I wanted her to sit with it, to process everything without me rushing to smooth things over. That wasn't my job anymore. When I came downstairs, she was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee, the folder in front of her. Her hair was tied back, and her face looked tired, but there was a softness in her expression I hadn't seen in years. Morning, I said, grabbing my own mug. She glanced up at me, hesitating. Morning. For a second, it felt like we were strangers trying to navigate each other's emotions. Usually, Clara was the one leading the charge in the mornings, chatting about her plans for the day or Lily's school activities. But today, she seemed uncertain, like she wasn't sure how to start. Finally, she spoke. I read everything in that folder. I sat across from her, nodding. And, she sighed, wrapping her hands around the mug. It's hard to see myself like that. To see how much I hurt you without even realizing it. It wasn't about hurting me, I said, keeping my tone calm. It was about not seeing me. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked down at her coffee. I thought I was doing enough. I thought anniversaries, holidays, and all the other stuff made up for the times I forgot. It doesn't work that way, I said, leaning back in my chair. Marriage isn't a balance sheet where you can just cancel out neglect with a fancy dinner once a year. It's about showing up consistently, not just for anniversaries, but for the little things too. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. You're right. I've been so focused on the big milestones that I forgot the small ones matter just as much, sometimes even more. She looked up at me, her voice trembling. I know I can't undo the years I've spent taking you for granted, but I want to start trying. I want to make things right. I studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity. She wasn't just saying it to placate me. I could see the guilt and determination in her eyes. Okay, I said finally. Let's start now. Her eyebrows furrowed. Now? What do you mean? I stood up and grabbed a small box I'd tucked away in the pantry earlier that morning. I placed it on the table in front of her. What's this? She asked, staring at the box. Open it, I said. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside was a notebook, plain and unassuming. She flipped it open to find the first page filled with my handwriting. It's a journal, I explained. Every year on my birthday, I've written down how I felt, what I hoped for, what I wished you'd notice. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the pages. You've been doing this for years? 15 years, I said. I didn't just keep the photos and receipts. I kept the feelings too. Tears slid down her cheeks as she read the first entry. Year 1. I hope she remembers. It's the first birthday we're celebrating as a married couple. I don't need anything big, just something that shows she thought about me." Her voice cracked as she read aloud. "I bought my own cake today." "Keep reading," I said gently. She flipped to another page. "Year 5. She forgot again. She said she'd make it up to me, but she didn't. I'm starting to wonder if my birthday just doesn't matter to her." Clara put the notebook down, her shoulders trembling as she cried. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." I reached out, covering her hand with mine. "I know you didn't. And that's why I kept going. Because I thought if I just waited long enough, you'd see me. But the truth is, Clara, I should have said something sooner." She wiped her eyes, sniffling. "Ethan, I don't deserve you." I shook my head. "That's not what this is about. It's not about blame or guilt. It's about moving forward. About making sure neither of us feels invisible again." She nodded, swallowing hard. "So, what now?" I leaned back, taking a sip of my coffee. "Now, we start small. No grand gestures, no over-the-top promises. Just consistency." Her lips twitched into a small, hesitant smile. "Like remembering your birthday next year?" "Exactly," I said, chuckling. "And maybe showing up with a cupcake instead of almond milk." She laughed through her tears, the sound light and genuine. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. After breakfast, Clara spent the rest of the day with the journal, reading every entry, absorbing every word. She didn't rush through it or try to gloss over the painful parts. She sat with it, letting the weight of my feelings sink in. By evening, she handed it back to me, her expression solemn. "I want to add to this," she said. "Not just your birthday, but everything else I've missed. I want to write down what matters to you, so I never forget again." I nodded, sliding the journal back to her. "It's yours now. Use it well." That night, as we sat together on the couch, I realized something important. This wasn't about winning or proving a point. It was about creating a relationship where both of us felt seen, valued, and heard. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt like we were finally getting there. By the time our anniversary weekend rolled around, I felt the weight of what had happened start to lift. Clara had been making a visible effort since our talk. Small gestures here and there, a handwritten note she left on my desk, a warm hug when I came home from work, even remembering to pick up my favorite coffee beans from the store. It wasn't monumental, but it was something. That morning, she was buzzing with excitement. I could see it in the way she moved around the house, glancing at her phone every few minutes, checking her bag as though she might have forgotten something. The anticipation was practically radiating off her. "So, what's the plan for today?" she asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. I glanced up from my book. "You tell me. It's your big day." Her face fell slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing her features. She'd been hoping for a surprise, some grand reveal to cap off her meticulous planning. I gave her nothing, keeping my expression neutral. "Well," she said hesitantly, "I thought maybe we could go out for lunch, and then," she trailed off, clearly fishing for some indication that I had more planned. "Lunch sounds nice," I said. "Let me know when you're ready." Her disappointment was obvious, but she tried to hide it. She smiled tightly and nodded, heading upstairs to get dressed. When she came back down, she was wearing the dress she'd picked out for the anniversary, the one she'd hung on the back of the bedroom door days ago. It was elegant, understated, and perfectly suited for a romantic outing. She looked beautiful, and for a moment, I almost felt bad for what I was about to do. Almost. We drove to the restaurant she'd suggested, a quaint little spot she loved for its ambience and overpriced menu. The conversation was polite but strained. I could tell she was waiting for me to reveal some kind of surprise, some indication that I hadn't completely forgotten. When the waiter brought the check, I paid without hesitation, then leaned back in my chair. "What's next?" I asked. Her smile faltered. "Next? I thought you might have something planned." I raised an eyebrow. "Planned? Like a surprise?" Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "I mean, it is our 15th anniversary." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Clara, do you remember what you gave me for my birthday last year?" Her eyes darted back to me, confusion mingling with guilt. I I don't think I gave you anything. I nodded. You didn't. In the year before that? She bit her lip, saying nothing. I didn't forget our anniversary, I said softly, watching her reaction. But I did decide to do something different this year. Instead of planning everything, I wanted to see what it felt like to sit back and let someone else take the lead. Her mouth opened slightly, as if to argue, but no words came out. For 15 years, I've been the one carrying the weight of these celebrations, I continued. I've been the one planning, surprising, and making sure you feel special. And for 15 years, my birthday has been an afterthought, if it was thought of at all. Clara's face crumpled, and she reached for my hand. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I've been selfish. I didn't mean to take you for granted, but I see it now. I really do. I nodded, squeezing her hand. I know you do. And that's why I'm giving you this. I reached into my pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table. Her eyes widened as she took it, hesitating before opening it. Inside was a printed reservation for a weekend getaway at a luxury resort. You planned this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Of course I did, I said. Because despite everything, I love you, Clara. And I wanted this anniversary to be special. But it comes with a condition. She looked up, her brow furrowed. What condition? No more forgetting, I said firmly. No more excuses. If I can show up for you every year, you can do the same for me. She nodded quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. I promise, Ethan. I'll never forget again. I'll make sure you feel as loved and appreciated as you've made me feel. I leaned back, finally letting myself smile. Good. Because this isn't about the past, Clara. It's about making sure the future looks different. She reached across the table and took both of my hands in hers. You're a better man than I deserve. I don't need you to feel guilty, I said. I just need you to see me. That's all I've ever wanted. She nodded, her eyes full of sincerity. I see you, Ethan. I promise I do. The rest of the day felt different. Lighter. Clara was quieter than usual, but it wasn't the silence of frustration or disappointment. It was the silence of reflection. I could see her turning everything over in her mind, trying to process what the day had meant. That evening, as we packed for the trip, she came into the bedroom holding a small box. What's this? I asked, raising an eyebrow. It's for you, she said, sitting beside me. I opened the box to find a watch, a beautiful, sleek design that was exactly my style. I picked it out months ago, she admitted. I was going to give it to you tonight, but after everything you said, it didn't feel like enough. I don't want to just give you a gift, Ethan. I want to give you what you've given me all these years. Effort, thought, love. I looked at her, surprised by her honesty. Thank you, Clara. This means a lot. She smiled, her eyes glassy with emotion. No, Ethan, you mean a lot. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. For the first time in years, I believed her. The weekend trip was perfect. The resort was even more stunning than I'd expected. A peaceful escape tucked away in the hills, with views that seemed to stretch on forever. Clara was still quiet, but this time it wasn't awkward or tense. It was thoughtful, introspective, and somehow more present than she'd been in years. Our suite had a balcony overlooking the valley, and as we unpacked, I caught her staring out at the horizon, her expression soft. I walked over and wrapped my arms around her from behind. Penny for your thoughts? I asked. She leaned back into me, letting out a small sigh. I'm just thinking about how much you've done for us, for me, over the years, and how little I've given back. You've given plenty, Clara, I said gently, but maybe we just haven't always been on the same page. She turned to face me, her eyes serious. I don't want to keep taking you for granted, Ethan. I don't want to be the kind of person who only realizes what they have when it's too late. I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then don't be. Change starts now. She smiled faintly, but I could see the determination in her eyes. This wasn't just guilt talking anymore. This was resolve. That evening, we had dinner on the terrace, watching the sunset as the staff brought out course after course of beautifully prepared dishes. Clara was quieter than usual, but when she did speak, it wasn't the surface-level chatter I was used to. Ethan, she began, setting her glass of wine down. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, leaning back in my chair. Why didn't you ever bring this up before? I raised an eyebrow. You mean the birthdays? She nodded. All of it. The way you felt overlooked. The way I kept forgetting. Why didn't you say anything sooner? I thought about her question for a moment before answering. I guess I thought it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself it didn't matter, that you were busy or distracted, and that I shouldn't make a big deal out of it. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I was being petty, or that you'd brush it off. Her face fell, and she reached across the table to take my hand. I wouldn't have brushed it off, Ethan. I might have been distracted, but I would have listened. I would have tried to do better. I gave her a small smile. Maybe, but part of me didn't want to risk finding out. It was easier to let it go than to face the possibility that it wouldn't change anything. She squeezed my hand, her voice firm. Well, it's going to change now. I promise you that. We finished dinner under the stars, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were really connecting. Not just as husband and wife, but as partners who genuinely saw each other. The next morning, we decided to take a hike along one of the resort's trails. Clara was unusually cheerful, pointing out wildflowers and taking pictures of the scenery. I could tell she was trying, and it warmed something in me I didn't realize had grown cold. At one point, we reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. Clara sat on a rock, catching her breath, and motioned for me to sit beside her. This place is incredible, she said, looking out at the landscape. It is, I agreed. But you've been awfully quiet today. What's on your mind? She glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about what you said, about how I didn't see you. And I realized, you're right. I've spent so much time focusing on the big moments, the anniversaries, the holidays, that I forgot to pay attention to the little ones. I nodded, letting her continue. I don't want to be that person anymore, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want to miss the things that matter to you, Ethan. Your birthdays, your achievements, your feelings, they should matter just as much as mine. And I want to make sure they do. Her sincerity took me by surprise. I could see the emotion in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted nervously as she spoke. Clara, I said softly, this isn't about keeping score. It's not about who did what or who forgot when. It's about making sure we're both in this together, that we both feel seen and valued. That's all I've ever wanted. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I know, and I want that too. I want to be the kind of wife who makes you feel as special as you've always made me feel. I smiled, reaching out to take her hand. Then we're on the right track. We sat there for a while, watching the wind ripple through the trees and listening to the distant sound of birds. It felt peaceful, like we were finally stepping into a new chapter of our marriage. Later that evening, as we sat on the balcony of our suite, Clara surprised me again. She pulled out a notebook and handed it to me. What's this? I asked, flipping through the pages. It's a list, she said, of all the things I want to remember about you. Your favorite foods, the things that make you laugh, the moments you've told me meant a lot to you. I looked at her, stunned. You made this for me? She nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. I want to make sure I don't forget again, Ethan. I want to get it right this time. I closed the notebook and pulled her into a hug. Clara, this means more to me than you know. For the first time in years, I felt like we were finally seeing each other, really seeing each other. And for the first time, I believed that things could be different. When we returned home from the trip, things felt different, not just with Clara, but within me. It was as if a weight had been lifted, the kind that comes from years of suppressing how I felt. Clara seemed lighter too, more intentional in her actions. The official anniversary dinner was set for the following weekend. Clara insisted on hosting a small gathering at home with a few close friends and family members. In the past, I might have done most of the work, planning, coordinating, and making sure everything went smoothly. This time, I took a step back. I wanted to see if Clara would follow through on her promise to do better. To her credit, she did. The day of the celebration, I walked into the dining room to find Clara putting the final touches on the table. She'd gone all out, candles, floral centerpieces, personalized place cards for each guest. The smell of roasted chicken and baked potatoes wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of soft jazz playing in the background. "Wow," I said, taking it all in. "This looks amazing." She turned to me, her cheeks flushed from rushing around. "You think so? I just wanted everything to be perfect." "It's more than perfect," I said, walking over to kiss her on the cheek. "You've outdone yourself." She smiled, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "I wanted tonight to be special, for both of us." "It already is," I assured her. By the time the guests arrived, Clara was in full hostess mode, greeting everyone with hugs and warm smiles. Our daughter, Lily, helped pass out drinks, and even Luna, the cat, made an appearance, weaving between people's legs as if she were part of the celebration. As the evening went on, I noticed something different about Clara. She wasn't just putting on a show for our guests. She was genuinely present, making sure I felt included and appreciated. When someone asked about our anniversary trip, she gave me credit for planning it, something she rarely did in the past. "Ethan really went above and beyond this year," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "It was one of the best weekends we've ever had." Hearing her say that in front of everyone felt like validation, not just for the trip, but for all the years I'd quietly given my all without expecting much in return. Dinner was a success, and by the time dessert rolled around, Clara stood to make a toast. I hadn't expected it, but when she clinked her glass, everyone fell silent. "I just want to say a few words," she began, glancing around the table. "First, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate 15 years of marriage. It means so much to us to share this milestone with people we love." She paused, her gaze settling on me. "But most importantly, I want to take a moment to thank Ethan. For 15 years, he's been my rock, my partner, and my biggest supporter. And while I haven't always been the best at showing it, I want you to know how much you mean to me." The room was quiet, everyone watching her as she continued. "This past year has been a wake-up call for me. It made me realize that marriage isn't just about big milestones. It's about the little moments, the ones we sometimes take for granted. And I know I've taken you for granted, Ethan, more times than I care to admit." Her voice trembled slightly, and I could see the genuine emotion in her eyes. "So tonight, I want to make a promise. To you, to myself, and to everyone here, that I will do better. I will be better. Because you deserve that." The table erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. All I could focus on was Clara, standing there with tears in her eyes, making a promise I knew she intended to keep. When she sat back down, she reached for my hand under the table. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered. "I never will," I said softly, giving her hand a squeeze. After the dinner, when the guest had gone and the house was quiet again, Clara and I sat on the couch, sharing the last slice of cake. "Did I do okay tonight?" she asked, her voice tentative. "You did more than okay," I said. "You made me feel seen, Clara. That's all I've ever wanted." She leaned her head against my shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to keep trying, Ethan. I promise." I kissed the top of her head, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of our marriage alone. We were finally sharing it, the way we should have been all along. That night, as we lay in bed, Clara reached for my hand and laced her fingers through mine. "Happy anniversary," she said, her voice warm and full of love. "Happy anniversary," I replied, smiling in the dark. And for the first time in 15 years, it truly felt like a celebration for both of us. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I woke up to the smell of coffee wafting through the house. Clara was already up, humming softly in the kitchen. It wasn't unusual for her to start the day early, but something about her energy felt different. Lighter, maybe. I walked in, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. She was at the table with her laptop open, her hair tied back and a notebook beside her. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Morning," she replied, smiling up at me. "I was just going through a few ideas." "For what?" I asked, leaning against the counter. She glanced down at the notebook, then back up at me. "For your birthday." I nearly dropped my mug. "My birthday?" She nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I know it's months away, but I want to make sure I get it right this time. I'm planning ahead." I stared at her, caught between surprise and disbelief. Clara, you don't have to do all that. I know I don't have to, she said, closing the laptop. But I want to. This is important to me, Ethan. You're important to me. Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Well, I said, setting my mug down and walking over to her. If this is the new you, I think I'm going to like it. She laughed softly, standing to wrap her arms around my waist. It's not the new me. It's just the me I should have been all along. I kissed her forehead, holding her close. For the first time in years, I believed her. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more changes. Clara wasn't just saying the right things. She was doing them. She'd leave little notes in my lunch bag, simple messages like, "Have a great day," or "Can't wait to see you tonight." She started asking about my day and actually listening to the answers. It wasn't just the big gestures or the planning for my birthday. It was the small, everyday actions that made me feel like I mattered to her again. One evening, as we sat on the couch, she handed me a thick envelope. "What's this?" I asked, opening it carefully. It's my way of rewriting history," she said, her voice hesitant. Inside were pages, typed, handwritten, even printed emails. It was a timeline of all the moments she'd missed, the birthdays she'd overlooked, and the milestones she'd forgotten. But instead of glossing over them, she'd written new entries. For example, under my 40th birthday, she'd written, "Ethan, I'm sorry I didn't make this day as special as it should have been. You deserved so much more, and I regret that I let the moment pass. I hope I can make your next birthday unforgettable." I flipped through the pages, my throat tightening as I read her words. "You did all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, watching me nervously. "I know I can't undo the past, Ethan, but I wanted to acknowledge it, to own up to my mistakes and show you that I'm serious about doing better." I closed the envelope, setting it aside before pulling her into my arms. "Clara, you don't have to keep proving yourself to me. The fact that you're trying means more than anything." She pulled back, her eyes wet with tears. "I don't want you to just feel loved. I want you to know you're loved." Months later, when my birthday finally arrived, it was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Clara had planned everything down to the smallest detail. A dinner with friends, a cake in my favorite flavor, and even a surprise trip to a cabin in the mountains. But what mattered most wasn't the grand gestures. It was the way she looked at me when I blew out the candles, the way she held my hand as we opened the gifts together. It was the way she made me feel seen, valued, and celebrated. "I hope I got it right this time," she said nervously as we sat by the fireplace later that night. "You did," I said, smiling at her. "You got it exactly right." Looking back, I realized that the change in Clara wasn't just about me. It was about us. By confronting the imbalance in our marriage, we'd opened the door to something deeper, something more honest. It wasn't always perfect. We still had disagreements, and there were still times when life got in the way. But the difference was that we were both trying, both showing up for each other in ways we hadn't before. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of our relationship alone. And Clara? She'd become the partner I always knew she could be, the partner I'd always hoped for. As we celebrated our 16th anniversary the following year, surrounded by friends and family, Clara stood to give a toast. "This past year has taught me so much," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "It's taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or big milestones. It's about the little things we do every day to show we care. And Ethan, you've always been the one to show me that. I just needed to catch up." The room erupted in applause, but all I could see was Clara, her eyes shining with sincerity. When she sat back down, she leaned over and whispered, "Happy anniversary, Ethan." "Happy anniversary," I whispered back, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, our love felt balanced, and that, more than anything, was worth celebrating.